Hello and thank you for joining us for another one of our Green Room conversations as part of the Ulster Orchestra's digital output. For this one we thought we would try something a little bit different and create a conversation between two of our collaborators. One of the best things that I think the orchestra did in 2021 was to be part of the Outburst Queer Arts Festival. We undertook a major project, a new commission with composer Conor Mitchell, which we performed in the Belfast Telegraph building last year, to great acclaim and a real impact in the room, which we really enjoyed. So the head of that festival is Ruth McCarthy, and we've asked her to have a conversation today with our conductor Manoj Kamps, and I really hope you enjoy discovering what they have to say.
Manoj,
hi.
What's queer about classical?
Ooh. One would say maybe not so much if one stayed at the surface of things. But of course, throughout classical music and throughout history, there have always been queer people making music. I think there's very many examples of composers who were queer, performers who were queer, classical music and its link with opera. I think opera as an art form is, quintessentially queer, regardless of what it maybe has become today. But yeah, I think there's a kind of incongruity between kind of how classical music is perceived and the institution as it's kind of become, and kind of the sort of the grassroots of the classical music scene, which is maybe more seen as the fringes and where the new stuff happens. And I think those are, in dialogue and in conflict with each other, as always. But there's a lot to be found, I would say.
And you mentioned opera specifically there, and obviously opera at its very heart was always a form of music for the people and of the people, and dealt with political issues and dealt with challenging things. Is that why you're saying it, opera is inherently a queer form, or is it more that kind of idea of, what maybe perhaps is seen as camp or over-the-topness that opera has?
Yes and yes, because of course I think opera in itself, it's opera queens are a thing for good reason. Love them. I'm glad you said actually that opera has this kind of history of being a political thing. I just finished a run of conducting Traviata by Verdi, and that was a super radical piece for its time because it was the first piece, first opera that actually dealt with the subject of the time rather than a mythical, or a regal subject. But it was actually about a sex worker, which was so, so against the grain of the time that it had to be censored and it had to be set in a different time period, and no one understood what the story was about because it had nothing to do with the time period that it was then staged in. And we know that Mozart wrote operas that went against the establishment, and there's this subversive quality about theater in general where, we know this from Shakespeare, we know this from all of these authors, that it's a place where revolutions can start, and it applies to theater, but it also applies to opera. But another thing I was thinking about is the fact that opera and theater in general, again, is a place where people can transform into people that they want to be, or that they can personify on stage and explore parts of themselves that they can't explore in daily life. There's this wonderful spectrum of gender on the opera stage that has always been ambiguous. The way that there's this idea of trouser roles where male roles are sung by female singers, nowadays sometimes by male singers singing in their high voice, or queer singers if they don't want to define their gender in that way. There's this whole history of queering the gender and the voice, and the voice, of course, is a very, very important part of storytelling, of opera, but also of how you self-define. Because do you sing in your chest voice? Do you sing in your head voice? How does that project? Do you use that also when you talk, or is it something you only do on stage?
And how is it gendered? Which
exactly,
is very important.
And is a performance, or is it actually your real self that's shining through? So there's all of those qualities which in opera are celebrated.
And you mentioned that there have always been queer composers, and of course we know Benjamin Britten, Ethel Smith, and Tchaikovsky, and Aaron Copland, so many more. And representation is important, obviously, and when we talk about queer role models or queer figures. But I'm very interested in that idea of queering, of queer as a verb, rather than just representation in classical music. And you already hit on the fact that maybe there's a reputation that classical music is a certain thing, but it is originally of the people. So how do we kind of queer classical music? Is it inherently, I suppose, a queer form? Or is that what can we bring to it now in 2022, 23 that speaks to a contemporary queer audience who maybe feel that classical music isn't necessarily for them?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, I don't know. I think we should all start from a place of not knowing. I think that's in itself something that's queer. I think the idea that we want to kind of define things and be very strict and clear about things. I think the idea of searching for me has always been very important. I think my career also has developed in a way that I couldn't have planned because it doesn't follow a kind of strict, sort of straight trajectory. Started out as a choral conductor who also composed, and then I ended up doing a lot of opera and a lot of theater stuff, and now it's only later in my conducting career that I've come to the sort of core symphonic repertoire and doing programs such as this one, which I'm very grateful for. But it's kind of the other way around. Most people would focus mostly on symphonic music and then branch out into opera, or the other way around, and then start doing maybe some fringe stuff, if you want to call it that. So I've both in my life and in my career, I've kind of started at the outskirts, moving in. And I think, to try and bring it back to your question, I think it's, for me, maybe not about what the essence of anything is. I think we can discover layers in things that speak to us and have meaning. And it's also about the way we combine pieces, the way we shape the concert experience, the way we tell the stories, because, there's so many. I mean, we see this in museums, for instance, like who tells the story and what story do we focus on? Like if we have a painting, do you focus on all the big, grand white men, or do you focus on the servant in the corner when you talk about it? I think looking for the perspective of those who are perceived to be on the outside, I think is what queers any narrative.
And of course what you bring to it as well, what you bring to it as an audience and what you see in there as an audience is very important.
Because I think if you, just to finish that thought, I think if we could strive to emphasize aspects that maybe don't get told, narratives that are forgotten or erased or just not mentioned because they felt unmentionable or unimportant, frankly, to so many people who defined the canon and defined the course of history. I think that applies to everything, and therefore also to classical music.
Yeah. I'm particularly interested in Outburst and our work in looking at queer beyond the global north or beyond the white experience, which often is what defines it. New York and London, Stonewall was the start. Stonewall was the start of everything. When we know that the queer people have existed in from the Middle East to India forever. You were born and raised in Sri Lanka.
Correct, yeah.
And I'm very conscious of, because we've been trying to do a little bit more of that work around what queer is and what queer can be in different cultural contexts and different languages. Are you saying that in a classical context, in terms of the boundaries of what classical is seen as, do you see the boundaries of that shifting in terms of a move away from the kind of classical canon of white men?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's easy to kind of fall into the trap of saying like classical music is by definition this music, because that's what classical means. And I think there is space in that within the kind of the institution of classical music, because even people working within the canon, there have been those that have been remembered and played throughout history, and some that have had a huge career and then forgotten or actually actively suppressed, and we're kind of rediscovering those again. But in terms of like a broader musical sphere, I always feel, I think we're coming away from that, but there has always been this idea of like classical music and world music. And of course that's a distinction that in itself is very normative and borderline racist, I would say, because music is music. And even though I don't believe music in itself is universal, because there are all these different approaches to it, and the way you perceive music is maybe not the same as I do. And also, the way we notate music across cultures, if it's notated at all. Some music practices are only transmitted orally, so the idea that there's a kind of hierarchy between classical notated music within a certain paradigm and then all these other traditions, I think there is a spectrum, because of course we know that many cultural influences have traveled across the globe throughout history. A lot of composers used influences from other cultures with or without crediting them. So that's something we're also kind of working around to see how we can maybe acknowledge those things more, and also expose maybe the limitations of their approach, but also honor the traditions that their music was based on. And there have always been ways of kind of exploring the overlap and the intersections between traditions. So even someone like Ravel uses what we tend to call jazz, which is not, because everything is notated and there's no improvisation at all. But like, he was close to the heart of where a part of the jazz scene originated in Paris, and that branched out and became people like Oscar Peterson and like all the players that we love. But he started from the same ground material, and the same with someone like Messiaen, who was influenced by Indian classical music, and of course there's an age-old classical tradition there as well. So I think now that we live in a time when all of this is much easier to access with the internet and with global travel, et cetera, and all these composers can actually move around the world and interact, there is something that blurs the boundaries, because, like I was saying, like, sometimes music isn't something you notate, but it's something you transmit, and that's something we sometimes could do with more of, in the classical scene. Like, we have this kind of very strict way of like dealing with like what's on the page, So I think that can influence each other in a very positive way, but yeah, it needs sensitivity as well.
One of the things that I was struck by when I was, reading a little bit about you prior to meeting you, was that you very clearly on your website say queer artist or composer. And I love that, and especially because you're not working in a particularly queer form, or you're not a cabaret artist or working in a kind of something that was be seen as traditionally queer. And also I'm aware that sometimes that can make things more difficult for somebody. So what was your decision making behind that, about really fronting that about yourself?
Yeah. It's a good question, because it feels almost, as a part of me now because I think I made that decision sort of 5 or 6 years ago, so it's traveled with me a while. But I think the main reason was that I had been trying to somehow separate those two, as so many of us do all of our lives. And I found that obviously that isn't sustainable. And I think there's something about, the bell hooks quote where she says, it's not about queer, about, who you have sex with, because that's part of it, but it's about being at odds with everything around you. And I think that, to me, there are many ways of phrasing that, but I think that was the thing that I kept running into, like, not just in society, but also in the profession of being a classical musician. And also the idea, the expectation of what a conductor should be, what classical music is. There's like this strict box, and everything outside of that is, it's either fringe or it's kind of low culture, or both. And I think on a personal level, trying to separate myself from my work was kind of the exact opposite of the thing that got me into music in the first place, because music was always for me, and music and theater both, like that expressive art form where I could actually feel like I could be myself. So to have that in a way separated from me or taken away from me by being in a conservatoire system that kind of sets you at this bar that you never kind of had any control over, it just kind of was the thing that everyone aspired to. I think it just became very jarring, I think. And after a while, I just realized, like, if I'm going to stay with this thing that I love, which is the music itself and the sharing of it, and interacting with people and talking about all of these composers, but also being able to, to do things that maybe don't fit the norm of what a traditional conductor path is, or an artist in the classical music scene. I think I need to have that in a way as a filter for people. So, you book me and you get all of me, rather than me just doing a job of like, this is what a conductor does. This is kind of the masculine ideal of a conductor, but I don't subscribe to that. I don't think it helps anyone. And I want people to know that, for me, it's not possible to separate those things, and also not something I'm interested in anymore. So yeah, so I do post about, you know, HIV related issues, I post about inequality, I post about racism, and those are all things that for me fall under this verb that you said, you know, to queer. Because yeah, we are at odds with so many things in society, so why only limit ourselves to that thing that, you know, that's in a box? And you know, and there have been people before me and there will be people after me who fit into that box maybe more comfortably, but I'm not one of those people. So I feel it's better, it's kind of, if people don't want to book me because of that word, then I think that's good for both of us, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And what has been the audience response to that, or response to that, and indeed the fan response to that? Because I'm sure there must be so many people, young people, not just young people, but young people in particular in classical music, who maybe do have to keep that part still hidden, because while we're, you know, post-gay, apparently, it is still difficult for a lot of people in more traditional situations. So what's been the response, both audiences and instead people who are
yeah, I mean,
fans?
it's been mixed, because of course there are always people who want to uphold the norm and who want to police how you present and police how you interact with people, down to like what you wear. And I know that my female colleagues before me in the conducting profession have dealt with this, you know, for decades now, that they always get mentioned in reviews in terms of what they wear, in terms of how feminine they looked or how not feminine they looked. And there's something about, and that, again, that reveals how much people have come to expect a certain kind of person to be on that podium. So I think it's hard for me to say, because I was always someone who did like the odd job out, you know, so being a conductor, being a composer, being a curator. I think maybe if you're part of a section, then of course I would want that same individuality for that person. You know, there's someone in the London Symphony Orchestra, Maxine Kwok, who has this bright blue hair, and she's like, you know, an amazing presence on social media, etc. But she's also very, you know, she stands out, not just because she's of Asian heritage, but also because of, you know, the hair choice. But, you know, I think if you're part of a section, then also there are even more restrictive norms. And I think being on that podium, I have a responsibility also that I don't take lightly, in terms of showing kind of that there's a different path, even within that profession. So I wouldn't want to compromise on, you know, this is how it's always been done, so that's how I'm going to do it. But I bring myself to the table, and that means some things will look different or feel different, but it also reveals hopefully other aspects of the music, of the collaboration, of the, because like you said, queering is a verb, so it's also, it's this kind of method of community. It's a kind of anarchic, you know, model at its heart, which again, sometimes you need systems to make things run efficiently, because I think if there wasn't a conductor, for instance, then a program like this would take 5 weeks to rehearse rather than 3 days. Not that it's not possible, but, you know, we have to think about time and, you know, money, unfortunately. But we shouldn't believe in it. But, you know, there's all of these things, and I think as a conductor, you know, I have this podium, literally and figuratively, so I want to use it for showing that there are these other possibilities, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, the very function of art in any of its forms is to help us see things new. And I guess what's the point in repeat?
I would hope so.
Yes, you know, well, that's the ideal, and you know, to be able to kind of to bring a new look or a queer lens, I suppose, on classical, where it isn't necessarily there in terms of the composer's identity or their background, is really exciting. And I suppose to ask you that, I mean, you're non-binary, and you know, the way you're very eloquent on your website and in your blogs around that idea of queering and kind of non-normative. So is there something for you that you've yet to do, or that you're working towards, or that you often dream about doing in that kind of queer, in that kind of liminal sense around classical music?
Yes and no. I think my career will always be a non-normative one, because it hasn't been until now, and I don't expect it to become, because I mean, the scene is changing, the world is changing. I don't think the careers that conductors before me had are even possible in the same way. I think, of course, there will be a few always, you know, with kind of the institutions that stick to a certain way of doing things, but I think that's also not what I'm interested in. Of course, I would like to conduct in certain places, but it's not about that journey for me. I think for me, the journey is about doing music that I love with groups of people that are interested in music and are able to execute it to, you know, a high degree, because I'm also kind of a perfectionist, in a good way, I hope. But I would like to somehow continue on this journey of you know, blazing a trail in a way, because that's what it feels like. Like I was saying, there are female colleagues of mine who have gone before me. There have been colleagues of color who have gone before me, but I don't think there are, as far as I know, queer conductors of color working at this level, especially not non-binary ones. I mean, if you're out there, please reach out to me, because then I won't feel so alone. But there are, you know, and there is something about that you have to kind of strive towards always, that is about being true to yourself rather than about kind of subscribing to these kind of markers of success that have been defined by others. And of course, I have wishes of pieces that I would like to do at some point, and I'm sure it will happen actually. But I think always being engaged with composers, making new creations has always been a really important part of what I do. Making theater in spaces that maybe don't lend themselves to being theater spaces, but, you know, location spaces. So always having this kind of double-edged kind of career where I do the sort of traditional path, but in my way, and also doing all these other projects that to others might be seen as fringe, but to me are like the core of what I do also. I don't think one can have enough cores of what one does.